三界主，修三界之道，作界教能老，讲究八度大念界，大规界界界所能界，天主我修三界之道，作界大规界界界所能界，这老八年三。拉妹妹的名节，红波大家进了做解决了小花小花那三节是怕出这些对外记录就把这个天气特别新一点的对外家境人的这些月的就把这些就把它拉出在讲个话也对外那边这三些存在里面我们别当年来我图那对外送年纪那么那也管他们的这个主办的那么也可能让这把工业站到起着他们这个都大概去的都看个当了点觉得我们俩都听就把送就从把没把三节的拉家早喽哦呀大开始说的日本出去完了那我们继续也没当那我们年把钱把钱三节你几天年往给送几样的你都没钱我打算把那些钱呢开始送我的啥的这里是吧还是那我们继续也没当就我当几把当那我当是吧那我继续你也把当没把当那我继续也没把当年把啥把我打题我那我继续也没把年把钱把钱没年把当钱把钱当我打几天就我太大他们家你看着说是三节几天年往给有时候的看着有人啥呢你三节几明给他那节往给下咱们就要把要人马都天天先养大把出把养但把出把要马的现在我的地送我的是吧三节几天年往给送去养大你都没事Yeah.
Now, so as it says in the 60 verses on reasoning by Master Nagarjuna, then whether things exist or in their duration, their arising, their disintegration, whether things are inferior or mediocre or superior, these are taught by the Buddha in accordance, by the Lord Buddha, in accordance with the convention of the world, not from the perspective of reality. So what this is saying then is if we talk about a thing existing or while it's existing or the duration of the thing or the arising of the thing when it's being produced or the disintegration of the thing when it disappears or when one forms a judgment of something is inferior or mediocre or superior, all of these things are strictly established through the force of the conventions of language. They're not. The Buddha does not teach these things in accordance with some absolute or real way in which things exist. That's here real or absolute way of their existing, but rather teaches them simply in accordance with the way in which they're designated by language.
Oh yeah, 当天的卡说的，三节几天也往给送去养大牛都没谁干了，你明给他那节往给把下个咱们就也超过远了，明给大把咱就也超过远了，你打卡萨给打卡萨给打，那卡萨打把打，你肉往给拉了说话。你太大讲，你明给大把咱们，明给你叫把咱们的，你太大讲要把就个是话，你太大要马的话是呐，我对的，咱这要马的话是呐，咱太大明给咋咱们到把打啥是吧？这意思，你打。但是明天为七八考的是呢，他本来康萨到我的，明给他那就往个大这么一，明给接这么就也白。你打康说的康萨，你个康萨学完那些，你康说的大新闻呢，出版的嘎巴呢，康萨大新闻呢，出版的嘎巴呢，你明怎么去溜啊？ 명점주 류와티 명점대기 아니 티 제수 충위 명점에서 그 제수 충위 아니 또바디서 또비 나자 잠라 또비 나자 잠디 낭잠대기 또발라 낭잠대기 아니 가사기 대단대기 자와 쳐봐라 아니 지금비 시와라 아니 차신我几天把它查询，那怎么的？俺的社团体育瞧我切吧啦，俺的他也被参加选举那把样没吧？他也被参加选举那把没把人呗，俺的他也都要把交托过来。今天新闻了，对电报上，他也就要把交托过来。大的呢，刚才跟大把当，俺那肉给让老说话，明怎么就决怎，明怎么就决讲，决把怎么当，俺那多半大怎么演讲，刚才跟大那话当，俺那肉给让那话啦说话，这那话的，俺那差距出去来把它掉下来。差距出完了，俺那出去来把它掉把人家，那我怎么就特明白？俺那我们的这个嘛的。
Now, then one might say, well, there's all kinds of things that are said in the world. For example, people say that there's a real self of persons, or some people might even say that a rabbit has horns. So there's all these things that are expressed in the world, and those are, in fact, we find these things said in worldly usage. But so if that's the case, then how is it that what is being said here, that Lord Buddha teaches things in accordance with the conventions of worldly usage or the language employed in the world? How does that differ from these statements about real things, permanent functional things that some people claim exist, or a self of persons, or rabbit's horns? All of these things are expressed at times in different ways, and so we find within the conventions of language that these things are stated. So what's the difference between that and what's being said here? Well, these things actually, whether one's talking about a self of persons or a permanent functional thing or a rabbit horn, these things are actually completely non-existent. Nevertheless, it's possible for someone to assert the existence of such things, and at times we find these things asserted. But when we examine them more carefully, we can find that these things are not actually established in any way whatsoever. They don't exist when they're carefully analyzed and scrutinized. So the difference here is that when we examine those forms of assertions about things like a self of persons or the permanent functional thing or rabbit's horns or whatever, these non-existent things, we can find that the person who is making that sort of statement and holding that sort of belief, they are expressing something in language, and there is an appearance of those things to their thoughts. They are thinkable, but in terms of the way they actually exist, we can determine that in fact the person's consciousness who is making these kinds of statements is affected by a temporary source of error. Their awareness is their consciousness is in effect adulterated by a temporary sort of source of error. And so then how do we know then that these sorts of statements are false, and that the objects which these people are positing don't exist? Well, we can examine these things by undergoing three criteria. One, that they're not commonly, these sorts of things, a permanent functional thing, a self of persons, or a rabbit's horns, they're all equally non-existent in that they are not held to exist commonly in the world. They're not established in ordinary conventional usage by worldly people. And then similarly, they're are, in fact, contradicted by valid conventional knowledge, valid conventional reasoning, and then even if we examine them from the ultimate perspective, they're also vitiated by the reasoning which investigates the ultimate status of things. Therefore, these sorts of statements are simply false and are not to be in contrast to the kinds of statements that Lord Buddha makes, which when he's employing conventional language, the terminology and such of conventional language.
야, 다 된데 인상 가서를 해체줘도 두신 말이다. 낭점 대기 아니 자체 탐제 신유와 네가 니 대니오데 타냐님이 비춰 되자야 민게 따점이나야 민게 따점이 봐 지바이나야 따바점도 안에 나와도 얘기 네가 나와 니오 되게 나와 니 여봐잖아요. 낭점 되게 아니 예배 샤와 친이지 예매에 차바데 가와자 그래서 낭점 되라 아니 지금 낭점 되게 퇴단데 샤와 차바 지금 배 타냐라 맞아바다 차 맞아다 낭점 되라 타냐비 체면 내봐 예매매당 전담제비 체면 내봐 예매매당 tenzi nangwa te yang ane chaji chuji leba la tena tuyo mido ki ta ti go ne ane nang zam de ane tanya zam de nang zam de tanya zhuo mo jo ki chaba ta tenzi yin ba de.
So now then the main point here, and this crucial distinction between these false statements and correct statements, we're talking about the conventional things, and the way things exist actually in general, is that these sorts of things, rabbit horns and so forth, are, we can determine that they're actually, they appear, we can have, there can be the appearance of a rabbit's horns, we can form the thought that the rabbit has horns, and we can say that the rabbit has horns, but and similarly with the self of persons and a permanent functional thing, all of these things can appear to some awareness. One can form that conception, sort of construct that idea within one's mind, and then one can use language to express it. But all of these things can be shown to be completely non-existent, and the statements false. The ideas are again due to the result of due to the person being under the influence of some kind of temporary source of error within their consciousness, and this can be established because, for one thing, these non-existent things are completely non-functional. They don't operate within any sort of relation or functional relationship at all, whereas things which actually do exist and are cognized, understood conceptually and expressed in language, these things do function within functional relationships as agents and objects of action. And then, so if we apply these three criteria of, first of all, that things have to be generally accepted, commonly known in the world, rabbit's horns and so forth don't meet that criterion. And then second, that whether or not something is validated or invalidated by a conventional form of valid cognition. The first category of things, rabbit's horns, etc., don't meet that criterion. And then the third criterion being that if one subjects something to analysis which is trying to investigate the ultimate status of the thing, then the rabbit's horns, etc., don't meet that criterion either, whereas actually existing conventional things meet all three of those criteria.
今天被谈一个网络对那么早的下个人想到就要骂人是讲他军的那么就明白就三节几点你往给送去让他往你的名字他都行吧
So thus in that verse then it says there that Lord Buddha employs the terminology that's generally accepted in the world, that things there's a duration of things arise and they disintegrate. These terms are accurate. They express correctly the way things are commonly accepted as being in the world. But the Lord Buddha is not employing this terminology, using the conventions of language to express some kind of absolute, real nature of things. That's not what's happening there.
那可是怎么考的？
可是
马杰我继续对吧？搞吧是呗。
Malo.
希望马杰我继续对吧？搞吧了什么？对不对？对。我希望马杰我继续对吧？搞吧了什么也别难呢？他谈不得了。我当军帮搞吧，谁讲我得了？继续把呢马杰把困难这些查吧查，查不了没几天，这碰把没把寂寞到，继续比团的马杰讲。 아니, 오늘 초바이, 제수시 제도세나, 제발랑 오늘 초바이, 아니 제수시 제도세나, 제신반에 마제와 코나, 제발랑 오늘 초바, 아니, 제신반에 마제바, 제발랑 오늘 초배, 제시샤와 차나. 어디서 자나스 마제발라 제와시 저바 티세나 아니 마제발라 제와시 저바 티세나 티세 품바 차와 제비 체양 품바게 아니 전체발라 소베 차와 제비 체양 오메바 지미도 오메바 지미도데 오버 아니 그 메바를 지미도데 오메도 개념 바타스 是吧？这些把的马这把困难这些查吧查，你这吃不了没，吃不没去，太也是碰把没把进没到，才对把这啊，进没到把开来人把他，马这把当，就把他马这把他来吃把没为吃。
So we last left off in the rejection of the assertion that that something which has not yet arisen is that which is arising or being produced. Something which has not yet been produced is something which is being produced, and that has three parts to it. The first of these is the actual refutation, and that's given in verse 371. Someone might say a thing which is, and this is the assertion of the opponent here, a thing which is presently being produced is said to be produced, for although unproduced, not yet produced, it is approaching production. And then the reply to that is in the verse. A thing in the process of production is said to be entirely unproduced arising. And where it says said there, that's by the opponent, that's their position. Since there is no difference, why should the pot not be considered as non-existent? If a thing that is in the process of being produced is said to be produced because, even though it is entirely unproduced, it is approaching production, why should a pot, while performing its function, not be considered a non-functional thing? It follows that this is reasonable assertion, since there is no difference between the produced and the unproduced, the thing which has already arisen and the thing which has not already arisen.
Oh yeah, that didn't teach you more about that. 这些把呢马作讲马杰把了七肉多，台上康气接完了七肉就去马杰的，那这些把当马杰把了七八卡里话的是，这些把了几位七八当这话这话了就个的，马杰把呢几位七八当，俺那这位我话没必去那，俺那七八没必去那，但是呢，这些把的几位七八马作讲，几位七八当这位。 马杰把毛文把来是毛文把来，俺那七肉的就把开了没？这些把呢马杰讲，马杰把了七肉头，七肉实际上，马杰把了七肉是，他当那样，俺那看个些这些把的，叫完了七肉头去些马杰把这些这玩意就说是啊，他当那样看起，他看起叫完了七肉就去马杰的，是的对么着。
Next comes the rejection of the opponent's attempt to rebut the position, the position that's just been stated. So that's in verse 372, and the opponent here says there is a difference between that which is in the process of being produced and the unproduced. That which is in the process of production is said to be associated with the activity of production, whereas the unproduced is not necessarily associated with the activity of production. So the reply to that is, that which is presently being produced, though incomplete, is other than unproduced. Yet also, since other than produced, the unproduced is being produced. Since a thing in the process of being produced is associated with the activity of production, you assert that even when it has not completed that activity, it is other than unproduced and thus future, is in the future. Yet in that case, since a thing in the process of being produced is other than something produced, you are saying that the unproduced is being produced.
Oh yeah, that is about when you give a more ranching Jena, and a Majiva Jiva Kalangoa. Shankala Ramala Bajiva, Majiva Kalangoani. Jisimbanga Majuya, China Yoba Yumbacha. Tejan Maji Bajede, Maju Shaja Gemais. Oh, Jisimba Jivala Chiru to Jewish, Majiva Kalangoa Massa. Jivala Chiru to China Majiva Kalamba Massa. Jisimba the other Majuya. Jisimbanga Majuya. So, China. Jivi Chawadan driven all your Batanas, Madam Majunja, China Jivi Chawadan driven all your in Batana. Dunzen Tejang, Jivi Chawadan driven Majiva Kwana Jivo Shechawa Dunas. Dunzen Tejang, Jivi Chawadan driven Majiva Kwana Jivo Shechawa Tian Miride, Majiva Majunga She, and Dagon Matoba Yilas. Oh, Tadayong Matoba Suina, Majibane Majunga Sheva Dagon or Matoba Yila, Teletivi Chawa Mijube, Jawa Mino.
So then comes the statement that if things arise or are produced intrinsically, that is, if something that is arising or being produced arises or is produced intrinsically, then one would necessarily have to accept that that which has not been produced is that which is produced, and that entailment would follow. And so that's given in verse 373. That which is presently being produced, though not yet existent, is later said to exist. And that's here, said here shows the opponent's position that they're articulating but not acceptable. The unproduced is thus being produced, but the non-existent does not arise. Since that which is presently being produced is other than something produced, you must accept that it is unproduced. You might claim that anything in the process of being produced exists as a thing, because even though it did not exist previously, it has afterwards become associated with the activity of production. If on this account you say that an entirely unproduced thing associated with the activity of production is being produced, that too is incorrect. An unproduced thing, referred to as non-existent, has not attained its entity. One could translate this as own entity here. It hasn't become itself. Or one could just understand this as referring to being present, something that is currently existing. It does not undergo production because it is not engaged in that activity.
Oh, that's Tendudela. Sumba Tenduani, Zoba Yeji Sajula, Majabani Meji, Kangritana Jisimba Mebatese Kandijus. Oh, Zoba Yeji Sajua, Jivi Chavan Zoba, over Yeji or Chulas, Jivi Chavan Zoba, over Yeji or Chulas. Jivi Chavan Majabani, I knew all Meji Java, women say Java. Jivi Chawa de over Yeji. Jivi Chawa Majaba de all Meji Java. Majabani Meji. Kangritana Jisimba, Kangritana Jivi Chawan Zoada, Mazobi, Jisimba Meba Tisana, Kangritana Jisimba. Meba Tis a candidate, Sergana, Meba Tis, over Kashi Jisimba, Terry, and Jetty, Jisimba, and Casa Rangoni Jua maybe said. 원지 주와 주세자 매도
Next comes a summation of that, and here the verse reads, the completed is called existent, and Ruth has the uncompleted is called non-existent. I would translate that instead of in the second line uncompleted, I would say something like uncreated or unmade, referring to something that has not been created or made is called non-existent. When there is nothing in the process of production, what is being referred to as such? That which has completed the activity of production is said to exist as a thing, and that which has not performed the activity of production is said not to exist as a thing. If neither that which has nor that which has not completed the activity of production is in the process of being produced, what is being referred to as presently being produced? Anything in the process of being produced does not have the least intrinsic existence, is the way I translate that last bit.
Oh yeah, that is it. Copy 10 to what Constitution Mato, but the way about my imba, Peace and Juba, and Doba Tapa Nimanjur, say Gana. That Kangi say, Ani Ribe number Jabana, Ribe Jabana, Ani Juni Matoba, the way about me, but Tisana. Tese, and do them do remember Massa, Debuya ever remember Tisana. Do them, or do then you got them by maybe, and then them by maybe she say, and do them busy, they would give you Jubatan. You got a top on one Juba. They would give a Jubatan, you got Batan, they would give a Tias on Sissan, Jubatan, they would give you Jubatan, you got a buggy, top on one Juba. Tabani to Minjuro, Sikana, County Junior Majuba, Jabuya Bamaya, Tis and Jubatan, Doba Tabani Minjuro.
So then next comes the summation at the conclusion of the rejection, the refutation that's been given above, and that's in verse 375. Since without a cause there is no effect, both starting and stopping are not feasible. Investigation by reasoning shows that there is no effect without a cause. Since cause and effect then are not real, and since the bases are not real, the sprouts starting to be produced and the seeds ceasing to exist or stopping to exist is being intrinsically established is not feasible.
Oh yeah, that dilla. No, you got some made a Shiva Jeja room, and DJ Shiva Gaya Jim. Sugar Rashi Jutat on that Mutijan Shiva Newman said that this song was Langzula, Rashi Jitrua, Nana, Turna Rashi Jitrua Tomba. Tombate, that debate, Betty to all of my young widow. And when a Juma can get Druby, Jawata Pimela Solas. Ani, there are Jimmy Damo Watang, Juma Cambu Watang. Ani Mimalebi, Ani Casa, Chile Bagi, Ani Casa Sumshani. Ra Umina Sonasi, Juma can get Druby, Jawata Pimesolas, that Jimmy Demo Watella. Ani, or Tamotella, Ani, or Jumi, Ani Pimeta, saw de Pimetani Banang. Now I must have Pimetan to sham. Now what I sham by Niga Bacha. Ranazajabaya. Teaching to Tony Mato, you saw the Jabotella. Now what I sham by Niga Ra. Didn't do now what I sham by Yaba. Siene, Chatala saw Gelas, or Teleba, Tamotella chat, and Pimetani Bachana, Chatala saw Gelas. That Jumaka Ranila, and Jimmy Tam, the Shintana to Truba Tis and a Talang, Nangi or a day, and it is true now as a motto Talang Shamba Mela. Talang Shamba Meba. Oh, they down, and the sausage of Tony to the sausage of that, or to the Hasatella. Ani or then do Nayang, 된룩 샴바 매바 배자죠 그래 자 오라마 저 중국지现在先把买了，当我就买了把七里边大毛瓦特了，我就买了把那了，你那我怎样买吧？先把样买吧，我提醒都，你打，当年我什么都随便，但带送个多啊，但有让些就当把空都没去呗，所以叫我那么当，他就得钱，爸爸接着给一些的，那我也刚是东北当那我应该应该的钱，是吧？所以就问，爸爸娘们给谁别我呢？你那我也没办法，没谁不也没办法，是我觉得谁不也没办法，现在是我的呀。
So thus, sutra is given to illustrate this, and here the sutra reads, sentient beings, humans, and then Ruth has born from power. This actually refers to descendants of Manu, the humans. It's another name for humans, human beings. So sentient beings, humans, and descendants of Manu, whoever they may be, none that were born and died here were born intrinsically. She has in brackets. The nature of all things is empty, like a magician's illusions, but the Tirthakas are unable to know this. She says recognize, but just says no. The Tirthakas are unable to understand this. And then here the example is explained in the commentary here. For instance, men and women conjured by an illusionist or a magician cause the spectators of the magic, who think of them as actual men and women, to feel attraction and aversion. Although they also appear to the magician, he does not think of them in this way. And they do not even appear to those who are unaffected by the spell. So the three cases here are going to be explained, the meaning of this example or analogy is explained later. But the first group of people are the people that the audience for the illusion, the magical illusion, and the magician casts a spell over them and over the substances that the magician is using to conjure up and make the illusory men and women to appear. And then the audience is completely affected by that spell, and thus the things appear to the illusory men and women appear to the audience. The illusory men and women also conceive of these illusory men and women as real men and women. So they have both the appearance of the illusion, the thing appearing as real, and then they conceive of it as being real as well. The magician, him or herself, has the appearance. They also are, in a sense, affected by the spell and see the things they've conjured up, such that they see the actual the illusion of the men and women appearing. But because they understand that it's an illusion, they don't misconceive the appearing thing as real men and women. And then someone who walks into the audience after the spell has already been cast, they're observing what's going on, but for them there's no appearance of the illusory men and women, and of course no misapprehension of these appearances as being actual men or women. They have neither of these. So you must understand that these analogies apply respectively to the she has perception of common beings. I'm just going to read the Tibetan here. So then the example here is that there are ordinary persons who have not understand that dependently originated things are empty of intrinsic nature. And then the second case, and so that illustrates the ordinary people that haven't understand how dependent origination entails the absence of intrinsic existence. That's like the audience, which both has the appearance of things as being real and conceives of the appearances as being real. both cases. And then the second case is Arya, who has cognized emptiness perceptually directly, but after they have risen out of that meditative absorption on emptiness, they have it's called the subsequent knowledge, and for them then things still appear to be real, but they do not conceive of the things as real. So that's the second case, similar to the magician. So the ordinary people are analogous to the original audience, and the Aryas who have cognized emptiness are analogous to the magician. And then from the perspective of the vision of the Aryas in meditative absorption, the example applies to the third category of persons, the people who arrived at the show after the spell had already been cast. They neither see they don't see a illusory appearance of anything, and they also don't conceive of what they're perceiving as being real. They have neither conception, appearance or conception. So these three, the example illustrates the three persons, three types of person.
Oh yeah. That is what it is. Gomarasa Nalaya. Tenan Chundi, Teton Mission. Teton Chundi, Tenan Mission. Teni Choba Chuna, Jideranga, Sumba Truba Yin Teni. Tenan Chuna, Teton Mission, Segala. Ani Juma Kem, Jimmy Mazaji Milebe, Tabum Demo or Tella. Ani Casore, Jimmy Tishin, Talan to Nawatan. And Talang Tomba Matuba, Talan Say, but now and then Talang to Nayan, Talang Tomba Matuba Yizan, Tenachundi, Teton Missions. The Jumatam Kabuad, Jumitam Watelasha. Teton Chundi, Tenam Mission, Sega, Chile, Bitamo Watela, and the Sing Talangaton, the Chugure, the Sing Talangana, the Chugumare, the Teton Chudi, Tenam Missions. Teton, Tini Soba Jumna, Jideranga, Walla, the Zubatua, Segala, and Juma Kambu Watela, and a Tenanda Teton Soba Juba Yezan. And the Jideranga will attend to Batubares. What that 10 Nashi Chane, Tatani, Tadi Nashi Chane, or Totomania Mato, Sosakiola, Tenang, Tenang Chula, Tetom Mijo, then do Toma Macho. So, Papanyamsha Yela, Teton Chula, Tenam Macho, then do Nama Mebacha. Tony Dobby, and the dark castle or Jabam. And the castle, that only the Casa della Sosio Tedala, and a tenant that Tedong Choba Truba Yenzang, and it Juba Trubare, that the bell to catch on it. Tenant Tedong Choba Truba, Tenant Tedong, now that Tomba, Tenant Tedong.
So thus, this also is explained also in the Gombarapsal, the elucidation of the thought of Lord Buddha, and there it's explained how this example, the analogy of the example of the show, the magical show, illustrates as well the way in which things appear, the different kinds of appearance of things as being real, or the danang dang dantong, yeah, how to translate that?
That's right. I did the Chiba Jari. Tenang Chundi, Tenang Chula, Teton Michung.
Tenang Tonding.
Did you mark Cambo what the Tenang Dang? You meet the Shitalang Tomba Motuba in the Tenang Chudi, Teton Michute. Now, that you know Matua chat. You got you what a nation, you got you what a chat.
So now then, so there are two things. One, things appearing as real, and things being devoid of being real, being empty of being real. And so in the case of the audience, things appear to be real, and they conceive of them as real. Therefore, there's no understanding at all of the fact that things are devoid of being real. They appear real, and they conceive of them, they hold them to be real. In the case of the magician, things appear to be real. This thing appears, and yet they understand. The magician understands that it's not real, so they.
과제 주막해 보세요. 담모와 대상. 담모와 대라 안에 땅한 게 나와당 안에 대신 땅한 게 동바 마주바 인장 대동 뒤동바 마주바 인장 낭신이가 여가 대상. 아. 근데 대동 중에 대남 미중한테 치례비 주마땡들 치례비 담모와 대라 아 땅한 게 동바 조장 나와 마중하 대상. 是吧？气力不耽误的了。我在没是吧？你怎么看不我的了？你当然当的心当然你讲给，当然跟那我当那我的我在个那边跟那我马多，吃当然参与吧没吧？到人把咱那些，你太难的太痛苦，错不出来。
대낭 단단 통기 좁아
좁아 남동 이조 좁아 다 강했잖아 남동 이조 다 대낭 대동 좁아
Okay. Now then, in the case of the audience that's totally affected by this spell, the thing appears as if it's real. So there's an appearance of the thing as real, and there's no comprehension that the thing is empty of being real, that it's devoid of being real. So that's illustrating again the ordinary person's way of perceiving the world, and so things that as they appear to ordinary persons are false. They're purely false in that the appearance of the thing is appearing real when it's not actually real, and also they're not conceiving it properly as being unreal, being devoid of being real. So then the magician, on the other hand, has the sort of half and half. On the one hand, things still appear to be real to them, and that again correlates with the Arya's understanding of ordinary phenomenal things, where things appear when the Arya is not engaged in meditative absorption on emptiness. The phenomenal things still appear to that Arya as if they're real, but because they don't misconceive them as being real, they understand and they have the comprehension that things are devoid of being real. So they illustrate that, or the Aryas correlate with the second category there, the magician, and then the people that that arrive late to the show and are not affected by the spell in any way whatsoever. They don't have either the appearance of the thing as being real, nor do they have the comprehension of the absence. It's absent of being real. The two are not. Neither of them are present for that. And I think I messed up that last part. So yeah, neither the phenomenal appearance of the thing as being real obtains, but again, So for the Arya absorbed in meditative concentration on emptiness, then there's the appearance of the mere absence of things being real. That alone is what is appearing to them, but the appearance of the thing as being real is completely absent. It's not there in any way whatsoever. So in that way, then we can illustrate the what's called the combination of appearance and emptiness in a single event.
Oh yeah, that is good. We can Tanya with Tama Tuba, say Gala. Good we can Tanya G. Tama New Day. Roba is a good we can Tanya with Tama Tuba Town. Tandem Demba de la Rishi Doja Town, Rishi Doja de Tony Tony to the Jabata would shout. Roba, Rishi Doja Town, Rishi Doja New Day. 些多家的，这些多美的多家的，多美的多比出手呢，多美多比出手呢，你他进去给那些，结完了几遍那些都给我点了，把我来笑笑，是的的，多美的就是的，你。进去告诉天堂乐意教育没论的工作应把对写的，第一个这话写的干了，天堂点把的，你这些东美，然后我说不对不，我说才没，你那里边过来打把枪啊。对的，工作点把了，然后我说对不，我说才没，你那里节约过来打把枪吧的，我到底。他就留了样，加油，加钱一张，天堂乐意节约没，论的工作应把对，协会告诉，你打一些当媒体的，你有当把你的，你那边出去过来打吧。
So then the remainder of this commentary section says that phenomenal things are established by conventional valid cognition, whereas ultimate reality can be understood in two ways. It can be understood through conceptual and reasoning awareness that, for example, and particularly inference, which determines the emptiness of things. And then there's ways of understanding it which free from conceptuality. For example, the perceptual cognition of an Arya who is absorbed in meditative concentration on emptiness. So these things are to be understood in more detail as they're established in the commentary on the introduction to the Bodhisattva's conduct, which is by the author Gyaltsab here himself. So there it's explained how that with respect to phenomenal things, these phenomenal things have to be established in accordance with the proper way, the proper mode of cognition or proper form of valid cognition, which is conventional valid cognition. They can't be established through some sort of investigation of the ultimate status of things, because that doesn't find conventionalities as such, phenomenal things as such. And then with respect to ultimate reality, there's both the conceptual form of understanding emptiness, which is arriving at a correct inferential understanding of emptiness via the medium of concepts. That is, through the reasoning, one determines the concept of emptiness correctly and cognizes that through valid cognition. That's, again, using conventional, or rather using valid cognition, but it's a special kind of valid cognition which is investigating and analyzing the ultimate status of things. And then the final case of the understanding of ultimate reality devoid of conceptuality, that's where in the Arya's meditative absorption on emptiness, once they've achieved direct perception of emptiness, then the dual appearance of the object and the subject dissolves, and so no conceptuality is present in that cognition. It's a perception rather than a inferential cognition.
Oh yeah, that is the mewa said that I said to check it and Japan Navana, Milam Chishi, Juma Chishinto. Doesn't about them to Sabana, Duma Chata, Debakalana, said that then I see Castle. Ribatu Chitan Road. I need to say Jawatan, Yubatang, Levanam, Anita Castle. Milam Chishi, Juma Chishinto, said Riganam, Milam the Lambonala. Ani lambo na wata matuwa nashi, ani ten nashi, jumi tishin talado matuwa nashi, teta jang, demba chuba, na jang, demba matuwa. Ani teta kante re se, ani, tobe dazam, tabatam tu seba na, se o, dulu jingone meba. Na wata, ani dazam tu seba na, duma cheta demba kala ne, ani kaji mam, jibing on to Jem Mado, and a Duma Chana, Demba Kalane, said
So So then there's a summation stanza, and that's, I'm going to translate this quite differently from Ruth's translation here. So I translate the first line as, activities arise, endure, and disintegrate like dreams and like illusion, when they are mere signs and mere mental constructs or designations. This term dakpa is ambiguous. One can read it as a mere mental construct or mere designation. How could when they are all mere signs and mere mental constructs or mental designations, how could uncreated things be real? So here, this is saying that created thing or activities, actually it reads in the text here, duce rather than duce. I'm not sure if that's a typo or not, but in any case, if we read it as duce, then it's activities. They arise, they disintegrate, they endure and disintegrate, like dreams. In a dream, we see various things. They like an elephant or whatever, and we think, oh, that's a real elephant while we're in the dream, but when we come out of the dream, we know that it's not. And similarly with illusions, magical illusions, if one is taken in by the spell, and when we'll see the device which is underlying the illusion as if it's an actual thing, an elephant or a horse, whatever. But then when the spell is over, or one understands that it's just an illusion, then one sees that it's not real in that way. So similarly, activities or created things are mere signs. They're merely things that are designated through language, through the force of language, or they're mere mental constructs, something that is fabricated by thought. That's all they are. And if that's the case, then what needs to be said? How could uncreated things be real? They're equally unreal.
Oh yeah, that didn't really send out to the machine number 7 bushes. Do you say you turn cover combat but of the show to show John of Joe Cheta? That of the Churubatella, Annie, Rabbi Shabatambu Goa. Goang and Baki, Langa Hamapoma Gukwana, Lubenda Lama, Dana Papa Combat Tempa, Ni Chevina, Tambola, Lushun Cheba. That time Tambo Goa did Tambo Gani Castle, Shun Shabatella, Rabbi Shaba Goa, Duty Tamba down, Goang and Belanga Hamapon, Tambo Rabbi Shabatam, Goa, Duty Tambatella, Rabbi Shabatam, Goa knees. Rabbi Shabatam, Goa, Ni, then you did some Goa, Ni, Duja Koala Chapapana. Ani 어제가 거기 동안 영어를 시비 안에 타바토비치 일라스 동반이지 된치다 와시는 내가 마셔봐 안에 가서래 동반이지 된치다 와시도 망해봐라 안에 저 가양 코알라 차바빠네 안에 타바다 탐제 참바 나 가와지 미니베 가와지 미니베 안에 최담제 랑시지 주베 동바테 안에 나도 현배 주베 동바테 나도 현배 차배 진신 라 랑시지 주와시베 차배 진신 퇴화다 미대발라 네 사모 동반이 퇴비 퇴화다 미대반남 동반이 퇴 디체나 안에 잡아채 봐 임베 나르셔 따라 저리 좀 누바시와 아니 다주비치로 토마를 안에 김멤버 샤네 안에 세발라 트와게 람담바차와 임베
So then the title of the text of this chapter is given, and that's just as it reads in the translation there. And then the next exposition or chapter is number 16, which is refuting remaining counter-arguments, is the way she's translated the title there. And so this has multiple subdivisions again. The necessity of composing this exposition in general, the prakarana, or here it's this exposition, and then the next comes the way in which one establishes how one develops the establishment of the teacher and the disciple through getting rid of any kind of remaining attacks that bad opponents would be wanting to level against this. That's the second part, which comes right after this beginning part of the chapter. So the first is the explanation of the text of the chapter. Then at the end comes the title. The explanation of the text of the chapter has a brief exposition of the necessity of composing this prakarana, this exposition or chapter. And then comes the actual getting rid of the remaining assertions that are attacks that are leveled by bad sort of opponents. And so the first comes the brief exposition of the necessity of composing the chapter. So here it's given, these chapters were written so that trainees may enter the state of liberation through giving up attachment to samsara. Without ascertaining the meaning of emptiness as it actually is, one cannot develop enthusiasm for omniscience or even for liberation through the giving up of attachment to samsara. The emptiness of intrinsic existence of all phenomena frightens those who have not heard sufficient teaching and are bound by the noose of clinging to a self. As already described above, the path leading to liberation, freedom from some existence, worldly existence, or samsara, should therefore only be explained after first making the mind ready in the way that the death of a king's beloved queen was conveyed to him.
Oh yeah. Tadini, you can't see the tomba member na. Radu cheba tamjeji, dini soso koba che. That you can't see the tomba member na said, oh, na rashi to a tomba young. Number Shambhala service, Tony Dendu Shambhala, number Shambhala service, you can't see tomba member double nashing. 아니 셴베 아니 라시 주와 셴베 마르 셴베 라도 셴바 짱아버 탐제지 아니 디니 소소고바 쳬도
So then next it comes in the format of our text. It says, when the author and subject are also empty, it is incorrect to call them, when the author and subject also exist, it is incorrect to call them empty. That's the opponent's position. And then the rest of that verse is given. Also with regard to these three, whatever arises in dependence does not exist. That's the format that Ruth is following in breaking up the verse according to the structure of the commentary. So here then the commentary in this begins by saying, even though things are empty of intrinsic existence, they appear not to be empty and are thought to exist. They are thought of in this way for various reasons, such as considering them real. All of the preceding 15 chapters, again, chapter is the literal meaning of this term is exposition or some kind of explanation of something, but it's translated roughly as a chapter. Refute these reasons individually.
Oh yeah, Taniwa Koanga Baki Langa Sama Bongasilla, Jay Binane, and the Tabotoni Gobi Ruba, Chachama, and a Jache. That Tabotoni Gobi Ruba Telayang, Sum Chanigana, Tombani Cho, Sinji Minipadam, Tomba Mimbi Cho, 2 Minipadam, Riba Shankabache. Tela Tambo Telayang, Tomba Nicho, Sinji Minipadella, Tomba Nisi Michiba, E. Murdan, Gonzong Ribakaba, E. Benana, Tatambo, Murti Baimba, Murtela, Kanze Mawa Jana Yang, Kanze Mawa Jana Yang, Tomba Sheja Mirungo, Kanshi Dana Gujo, what Tennisum La Yoba Ming, that dig go up Tedaki Chedu, Rabbi Shebatana, Rabbi Shebatana. Oh, na tomba member 2 days. Tana over na tomba member 2 days. Kangise, Rabbi Cheba Mabu, and you cherish, Rabbi Tomba Buchana, you cherish, you sit down. Rabbi Jonga, Rabbi Jonga Dembi, 10 years, Jaja, Rabbi Jonga Demba, Jaja, 10 years sit down. 刚才我觉着那样在前，在去年纪最东北年纪，团结起预备。아니 지금 뭐 라시지 그 동화 세차 미룬 거 없어요. 어디 라시지 그 동화이나 아니 아랍들도 셔봐 좀봐 보여 예초고 말해. 잠베랍제야 용고 예초고 말해. 어때 미줘 봐 인장 제제 미줘 봐 인장 아니 다 라시지 두바 동화 세차 어디 미룬 세나 같이 때는 미룬 세나 야 되버주다.
So then comes the getting rid of the remaining criticism of a bad opponent here. It's got 8 subdivisions. We won't read all of these subdivisions because they'll come as we proceed through this chapter. And so the first of these is the rejection, rejection of some reasoning which supposedly negates emptiness. And that has multiple subdivisions as well, 3. The first of these is showing that one is unable to actually refute a position, the position of emptiness. And then that has 2 subdivisions, the actual statement of that, and then we'll get into the next topic later, the showing how the equivalence of the critics' attacks here are equally invalid, and that'll come after this. So first comes the actual point that one is unable to refute the position of emptiness. And that's given in verse 377, where it says, well, the introduction to this is, if these chapters were written for these purposes, things are established as not being empty, the opponent is saying here, because the author and the subject matter explained by the 15 chapters exist. The word also indicates that the words that express, the meaning of emptiness. Therefore, both in terms of the author, the speaker, the subject matter, the topic itself, and then the text which is expressing this, none of these things, they all exist, therefore emptiness cannot be the case. Therefore it is incorrect to speak of the emptiness of intrinsic existence of things. It's incorrect to say that things do not possess intrinsic existence, they are empty of intrinsic existence. And then the reply to that is given next, and also with regard to these 3, whatever arises in dependence does not exist.
Oh yeah. 다니네 고자다나 고탄주었다나 안데 최단 저자당 마오는 최단 저자당 저자 줘봐보면 저자 안 줘봐 쳐봐보 마오보대 마오는 줄라대네 주시 도바 체지 줄라대네 주시 도바 체지 라완도 주바 미라 가시 때네 quy 중화 시카라 가시 때네 quy 중화 저 요 가시라 때는 저거 quy 중화 테니 라시지 여바 미라 여바 미라 여바 미라 마오보당 저자당 치순보대 야 아니 때네 다바자 마도 아니 대순간라 라시 주어야 봐 마이베 아니 돈이 내가 주바인 세대라 같이 되는 quy 중화 테니 숨나야 여마인 세오 치순보대 때나 다바 인비치 대순나야 라시 주어야 봐 마이베 인장 아니 라시 돈바 내가 주바래.
So now then, the reply then is given in the second half of this verse. Also with regard to these 3, whatever arises in dependence, whatever is dependently originated, does not exist. According to us, the words subject matter, I'm going to translate some of the terms in here rather differently than the way Ruth did, so I'll just do that. According to us, the words subject matter and author are designations dependent on one another and do not exist autonomously. Whatever arises in dependence does not exist intrinsically. Since the author, subject matter, and words are all dependently designated, these 3 do not have intrinsic existence. Thus, emptiness is well established.
다 되라 원종 그리고 봐 되라 이와 건중의 일반에 가자 동비 예와 예 동바 마인 주나 메동 예와 동바니 지대 주바 주마인 어디기 가딘디 탐제 동바이나 아나 뒤에서 다 동바이나 안보당 전당 아니 매바죠 pom비라단 저와 연나 아니 대다단 요구 위치를 옹호 탐제 라시 주보 세나 너무 많이 주잖아. 다디 제라 가져 돈이 주비 예와이 칠라서와开량 거에 너무 많이 봐 주바 주나 녀와开량 봐 너무 많이 봐 주면 최종호 메도 봐 주비 예장 세와 칠라서 예와게 칠라서와 开량 봐 너무 많이 봐 주바 주나 최종호 메도 봐 주비 예와양 너무 많이 지디 주바 주와 많이 돼 예발 안에 开량 고그래 세대 어디 가져 동비 예와에 너무 많이 주잖아 메도 예와 너무 많이 지디 주바 주마이 세요
Sigla sobi denda kelang bichir. Sigla sobi denda kelang bichir. Sigla sobi denda kelang bichir. So then next comes the reasoning, which shows that the equivalence, that the opponent's argument here actually can be flipped on its own head. So here then the verse says, we'll do the introduction first. If all of these were empty, the opponent says, if all of these were empty, the senses and their objects would be like donkey's horns. But since they exist, things do intrinsically exist. They exist intrinsically. Then the reply to that is given in the verse. If through flaws concerning emptiness, things were established as not empty, why would emptiness not be established through flaws concerning lack of emptiness? So the first half of that is presenting the opponent's position. The opponent is saying flaws, that your argument about emptiness doesn't establish them as being empty. And then that argument is actually flipped on its head and shown why would emptiness not be established through flaws concerning the lack of emptiness. And so if on account of the presumed flaws concerning the proof of emptiness, the words and so forth were not empty because one has to accept their existence, why would emptiness not be established through the flaws concerning your proof that things are not empty? It follows that you should certainly accept emptiness because you accept the dependent origination of the words and so forth.
Oh, yeah. That's called that only don't be short to me by that more than Jumon Kava Yi Benani. That I won't really change Chonian, Dobata, Rangi Chonian, Drubate, Kati Sinji Choju, Sinji Chejochi, Gana Duce La Chimin. That don't need to Mawa, Sawa Zamjis. Sawa Makaba Zamji, and a rank short to Bariba Mino. Oh, the new Kalam Bukoani. Oh, the new Kalam Bukoani, and a Sanjo Tombani Tobatan. The new Tombani Tobatan. And a rank show, oh, the Batuba need a Chakova ina. Sanji Choni Tobatan, rank Choni Trubate, Chakova ina. Cheni Tombani Mawa Seva Zamla Juice, and Seva Zamla Juice, Kato, Sanjo Sinjiba Chaba, Sinjiba Chojila Gana, Ranjo Druba Chabala, and then Gawa Mimbadi, Gawa Chagana, Ranjo Drubi Druja Kaya Batamja, Tombani Mawala, Dujada Tsumba. So
then comes showing that one is unable to establish the position that things are not empty. This has two parts, the actual statement of that and then the rebuttal of faults that are attributed to this position, the rejection of those faults. And so the first comes in verse 379. The introduction says here, you cannot establish your own thesis merely by dismissing the proponents of emptiness. If in refuting the thesis of others and proving your own thesis, if on the one hand you like to disprove, why do you not like to prove? Opponents asserting that things are real must refute the other's thesis of emptiness, as well as prove their own thesis that things are real. However, are simply engaged in dismissing the proponents of emptiness. If on the one hand you like disproving the thesis of others, why do you not like proving your own? You should. To proponents of emptiness, whatever proofs you adduce to validate your own thesis remain as unestablished as that which is to be proved. So there's that fallacy of begging the question, or in a way. You should therefore give up adherence to the thesis that things are intrinsically existent.
Oh, yeah. Oh, they said that. 동문이 맨날 세자 매부 쳐서 계자 매바 캐라 그린다 뭐 담바 마위 쳐 담바 마위 쳐 주보세나 전담지지 리베 다위체 초카야 밑에봐 그러다 전담지지 리베 다위체 초카야 밑에봐 가데 용서 따와나 매간테 좀 미쳐나 세디라 전담지지 리베 다위체 초카야 밑에봐 예바 매바 저 전담지 리베다에 가나 아니 저 이세자的강미 군대 용어와 가야 매바是吧 군대 대나我看给点住去建议党点住去建议党点住去太太党你绝对没把那说不什么贵阳对的每个看起来每个确实没有那天那建议来说什么是的安尼点住去激荡等把准备太大不行安尼看是听你看到呀绝对没把它说吧贵阳日本区别安尼说嘛也把准备写的等住就在这开了我没下过是
So then comes the rejection, refutation of their attempt to avoid the consequences that have been laid upon them. And this is in verse 380. The assertion is given that when thoroughly investigated, the non-existent is not a thesis. The thesis put forward by proponents of emptiness is not feasible, since when thoroughly investigated, it is illogical. Something which does not exist as a knowable object, she says, or an object of knowledge, same thing, is not an assertable thesis. Therefore, the thesis put forward by proponents of things being real is established. The reply to that answer is, no thesis is feasible when investigated by the reasoning that analyzes the ultimate. Then the second half of verse 380 says, then all three, such as oneness, also are not theses, or all three, identity, difference, and indeterminacy, all three of those are not theses. Since negated by this reasoning, real oneness or identity, real otherness, difference, and real ineffability asserted by any opponent are also not theses. Therefore, one should not assert even the slightest degree of things being real.
Oh yeah, that's what riba xiang ga ba la ni mo sim ji dian dong ke ba me da ba dang dong ni zhui bei lo zhuo dian zhu me da ba wo dang mo sim ji dian dong ke ba me da ba ta la me da ba ni ka de mo sim ji qi pom de dong bi dian zhi tuan me ju ru dina shunglu lai shungwe tenzi yumin shendui me 다 pompa tenpa tawa, right? Pompa tenpa chubi, ngosunji pompa chema chubi, pompa tento chema chuba yena, ane pompa tentang, ane chuba ki tenzi tenpa to tawa te sungwa rumbari. Pompa tenpa tawa chubi tenzi tuya meshin, tuya meshin, niwa meba chude, shi kando ngosunji pompa tenpa tong, tenpa chuba thode ani khoja dana pompa denru ngosumji chuisi jena ya ani dendo riban jubar mawi chodena se gowa shenji shunglu la chungwe se taji mawi shunglu la chiwe tenze kailen ba yoba minde tesewa tenrawe tenze tegi ani 가서 주자 세월을 슈브셔.
So then next comes a rejection of other reasonings that the opponents here might employ. First showing that the idea that that things being devoid of intrinsic existence it can be showing that it's not demonstrable that one can refute things being devoid of being real by means of perception. That's the first topic here, and so that's given in verse 381. Someone asserts where a pot is directly perceptible, the argument of emptiness is meaningless. And then the opponent is saying here, the reason proving the pot empty of being real is meaningless and ineffectual, for wherever there is a perceptible pot, that pot is real, according to us, is thus established by perception. So the argument is that the perception establishes things, and therefore they're real because it observes them. And so the reply to that is given in the following position. The reply that is given in the second half of the verse. Here, reasons appearing in, she has textual systems, basically means the philosophical system of the opponent are not acceptable. Elsewhere they are. In relation to the theses of proponents establishing things being empty of being real through reasonings that appear in their opponents' systems are unacceptable because they is referring to the proponents of emptiness are engaged in rejecting them. The meaning here is that the opponent can't produce some evidence that just comes out of their system as evidence because it's not acceptable to the opponent here, the person who's establishing the emptiness of things as being real.
Oh yeah. 다 걸려서 서와라 슈브셔스 어디제 된도르베 주바마비 초대나 고와 현지 숑루래 추위 댄지开来吧要把만인 피를 된도 원아 숑루지 댄지 강도야 마주고 세나 지 강도야 마롱 댄지 강도야 마롱 세나 현도 고와 니가 좀더 숨바테 예바 고와 메도 다 니가라 퇴난도 주와게 아니 가서래 다 메다바 주발라 써와게 tenzi kita rwa da midaba dhubala sowa niga la tunando dhubake ane tenzi yawa yenzang tenzi kanto yama runga mare shendo gowa niga la chuda sumba te yewa kawa meto
Then you might say, well now then, does that mean that no sort of reasoning at all that comes out of somebody's system of philosophy is appropriate here? And then no, that's not the case, because in other cases where both the opponent and the proponent have a common philosophical view, then those things that they hold in common can be employed in the case of an argument, and there's no contradiction within that. So, for example, if one is establishing the impermanence of that sound is impermanent because it's produced or created, and then if there's no dispute about the fact that sound is created as evidence, then one can employ that reasoning to establish that the sound is impermanent.
다드니 돈이 주베 로저 된주 아니 주바 미대바 테라 아니 미도메바 동반니 칸라 중화 니도 추루 시다보나 주시니 매바년부 중화 추루 세어디기다 지디 동반님마와 최지 아니 돈이공 오케 랑싱스 양신지 동반님마와 최지 돈이공 오케 랑싱 동바 민발라 마드비 동바양 아니 동바 민발라 마드바기 동바양 미테베 아니 오데바 추바레 스나 동바 민발라 마드비 동바양 미테베 오나 데바 추체나 난이 가서래다 돈이 예배 로저 된주 예바 돈이 예바 인자 뒤 미디 초마 로저 된주 예바 미주와타 미주와타 된주 예바 미주와타 돈이 예배 로저 된주 예바 미주와타 돈이 된주 예나 시체장 오고 된주 타나양 돈이 된주 예나 아니 최전 시공보야 된주 예바 타나양 덴베 미동와 매베세 덴베 미동와 매베 예면 강인장 안에 덴베 동와 인장 덴베 미동와 매베 아니 테메바 동바나 덴주 안 테메바 동와나 아니 덴주 가라니 덴주도 강하나 중앙이도 주시 최전양 아니 덴바 주바 쓰고 말이 야
So next comes showing that in the establishment of emptiness, it's not demonstrable that one is in the process establishing the contrary of that, which is things being real, and that's given in verse 382. The opponent would say, can assert here, you proponents of emptiness accept, and she has entity. I'm translating that as character in this context. You proponents of emptiness accept the character of emptiness, and since emptiness is not feasible unless it is contingent on non-emptiness, things are real. The reply to that is, it follows that the existence of emptiness does not establish its opposite, that there is real, something is real, that there are real things. The reply that's given in the verse, when there is nothing that is not empty, how can emptiness be so? When the one does not exist, why should the antidote not exist as well? Why should the antidote not exist? If emptiness were real things as its basis would be feasible, but as there is nothing that is not devoid of being real, how can emptiness be real? Its basis cannot possibly be real. Why, when the basis is not real, would the antidote, or the contrary of that which negates it, also be real? For emptiness to be real, its basis would have to have a real nature, have some nature which is real.
Oh yeah, there is one. Don't you do the she children? Oh, don't do Tanayang, say 아니 덴베 미동와 매베니 가서는 미동 매바 동바니 세 그래 덴베 미동와 매베 테메바니 동바 된주 칸라 주데 아니 주원이도 또 칸라 주원이도 주디 시처전 칸 유시처전 덴바 주와 미스비세르 세제제 칸라 주원이도 주루세는 시다 보니 주시네 매바니 뭐 중화 주루 세더라 굉장히 시다 보나 就是是确见人路你没把人的东西确见是确见的东西确见的人路对没把你太国际人员不人路中啊就是人路你没把太国际人员不人路中啊国际人员不人路中啊就是当你电报中了是确见人路你的电过个切了是当你电报中了是切了人路几当你的电过的当你电报马主把人家他就对不对啊
So then this shows that, again, if emptiness were real, then real things to function as its basis would have to exist, would be feasible. But because there's nothing that is not devoid of being real, how could emptiness itself be real? Its basis, the thing that it is based upon, cannot possibly be real. Why, when the basis is not real, would the antidote, which negates it being real, that is the emptiness of it, be real? For emptiness to be real, its basis would have to have this character of being real, necessarily.
That's right. Oh, yeah. 现在记得我们去见的人们国际人以后，等着没把那太国际人，要不等着对中国决定没就是些。但我中南的去见等着就当年的点过去，这些呢，看的没动军赛也东北也把看了，东北军赛也把去了，是吧？没动我军赛也在东北军赛也把去了。那年呢？ 가자 여바 마인배 양다 튼에 까메사 가자 된도 여바 아니 가소래 가자 된도 여바 된도 뭐 라시지 여바 마인배 다디 되니래잖아 가자래잖아 가자 된도 여바 마인배 양다 튼에 까메사 아니 양다 튼에 까메사 가자 된도 까바기 아니 가자 아니 까바기 메가데 아니 여바 양다 튼에 까메사 写什么大佬？
杨大都你干咩啥？
杨大都呢干咩啥事干啦？人都就出把干把给干些没干的也把啥事个也把啊。
So then this is explained in the fundamental wisdom, basic wisdom, the middle way. If the slightest thing were not empty, emptiness would have some existence. So that is shown there. And then the text called the two realities, the differentiation of the two realities, Satyadvaya Vibhanga, says since the object of negation is non-existent, and this is referring then to the thing which is negated in the course of the reasoning about emptiness, that some kind of real thing or real existence is non-existent. The negation clearly does not exist, and she has as its own reality, or in reality, one could literally translate that. Meaning here, since the object of negation, things being real, is non-existent, then how could the negation itself be real? It's not entailing some kind of real negation itself, meaning that the mere negation, which is the result of the process of negation, negating something being real, that mere negation is not itself real.
Oh yeah. That didn't carry that. And that when the gamma says that had don't you like Shamba Gaba. 大家给他动作了，先把嘎巴的呢，嘎巴我的卷棒嘎巴，但嘎巴我了在那样，俺你确实就要嘎巴汤。 俺你两个也别出去干吧，啊！大家给他一张茶，我就归了从不点吧，现在他这在送我们钱，啊，送我们钱呢，但他们确实很好干吧呢，我确实能往干吧呢，看的瞧你就。 最近呢，全面确定我去了，但他全面里面呢，看些媒体确实就是他这个刚才说的是呢，看的当年军赛奖没办上，让些就准备当年军赛奖没办，台上个确实没就没是，台上那样让路没把让路是给让路没把让路是开两百，全开两百就拉是。 当你们呢，让路没把让路让让些没把人在让路没把开两个，让路没把让路是开两百，全开两百就拉是，这里看说的，看这确你推军呢，确没确你我就是呢，没得说了马德巴确没白是，没得说了马德白确没白，没得就我不点把有多些呢。 미디초라 마데비 마데베 초메베 미디종오 덴바 요도시나 야
So next comes a rejection of, refutation of holding to positions which fall into extreme views. That has two parts, the actual refutation and then a rebuttal of any response that the opponent would come back with. And the first of these, the actual refutation, has three subparts. First is the refutation that this absence of a position which they're ascribing to Madhyamaka, the middle way, would entail some kind of position. And that's the first here. And so that's given in verse 383. The opponent here says, since there is not even the slightest emptiness, it cannot constitute one's thesis. Nevertheless, by accepting the absence of a system of one's own as one's system, one is asserting a thesis. Since there is no thesis which does not depend on a counter-thesis or position, she's translating chok as a thesis or position either way, counter-thesis, real things, the counter-thesis exist. And then this is given in the verse here actually says that if there were a thesis, absence of the thesis would in its basic character be a thesis. But where there is no thesis, what can be the counter-thesis?
yeah, that's all. 가대 코자라랑은 오르지비 초니도 주나 가대 초니 톤이나 세대 가대 코자라랑은 오르지비 초니도 주나 처음에 봐랑은 오여 주비지 처음에 봐랑은 오여 주비지 초진 오여 주나양 처음에 초진 오여 주르서라 랑은 오여 초지 주나 랑공오 주비 초 준사장 주나양 랑공오 주비 초 준사장 매배 매배 텔레드비 미디초장 미시토 텔레드비 미디초장 미시토 아니 태양오 denru지 초 탐제도 오 denru지 초 탐제 공도 가슴 바 사슴 비체를 사슴비치 대다 초매바 랑근 오 좋아니 매나 초매바 랑근 대다 초매 초님 대다 초매 니 매나 세다 대다 초매바 랑근 오 좋아니 매나 오 된주 강시 미디 초수 줄 오이지 좋아 매나 오 된주 강시 미디 초수 줄 투조다 미디 초 담바 좋아 도자야 매비체 야 아니 가서를 니니 돈이 된주 라루라 까바 인지 니니 돈이 된주 간루가 까바 인지 라루 매바 담바 샤바 미샤오 라루 매바 담바 샤바 미샤오.
So then the answer is given here in the verse as well. If there were a thesis, absence of the thesis would an entity or be naturally be a thesis or intrinsically be a thesis. But where there is no thesis, what can be the counter-thesis? If we had any thesis of things existing by means of their own intrinsic character, the absence of a thesis would be a thesis existing by means of its own intrinsic character. However, since we do not have any thesis of things existing by means of their own intrinsic character or intrinsic nature either way, a counter-thesis contingent upon that is also impossible. Moreover, all theses concerning real things have already been refuted above. Thus, if the absence of a thesis does not exist by means of its own intrinsic character, what real thing could constitute the counter-thesis? Neither the thesis nor the counter-thesis have even an atom of being real. By this we reject real emptiness being real, here meaning established by means of its own intrinsic nature or character in our system, which should not, however, be interpreted as meaning that or indicating that we have no system.
Oh yeah. That quality. That didn't. Never you be doing Gabatella. And a casore. Oh, maybe Chava then do number 2 number 2 metabata. 타시가 리베 크바당 타시는 내가 주어도 차라병 자면 마음이 봐 세제다 좀 예배나네 난 오이 켜봐 된루 내가 주바 미대반에 오이 켜봐 내가 주바 미대반에 가정오고 예민나 맨이 차와 지다 주 차와 매양 예민신 권이 되는 다바체 나 되게 오 내가 주와 예대 오 내가 주와 예대 매라서왜 차바 내가 주기 싫어서 매대바 마주나 매 아니 가서를 찾으시 봐 대만이 버전당이 버 제나서는 가정 오고 예매나 매니 사와치다 줄 세더라 가디 매니 치다 차월 랑공 오 주바 주디 미주와타 어디 랑공 매니 매 차위 라신이장 랑공 오 주비 안 차와 라라 차와 랑공 오 주와 주디 미주라 담바 주변 오여바 미나 아니 차왕 원지 주바 용셔가 말해서 단 태민비 세례 차위 매장시 여바니도 미시 공니도 다 가바르바 공니도 차와 매니 두제데 차와 member 치다 색 차와 매니도 아니 가서 라시 주비 아니 매니도 주나 차와 라시 주바니도 주나 아니 차와 member데 치다 색데 세투고 말했어 대나 비시 시자와 예미 대나 의미했어 아니 비시시와 대나 비시 준전 대나 비시양 매식자기 아니 비시아요 내바타위게와 예미 비시의 시자 매식자 비시면나 아니 매아여 봐면봐 예미 대나 매민 시와 아니 너바체 공도 얘기 가슴 비체를 세다
So next comes showing a rejection of the evidence which the opponent is propounding to establish real things, real functional things in particular. And this has three subdivisions, showing that establishing the specific qualities of things as being real by showing that the qualities themselves are real is non-demonstrable, is not acceptable, and then will come a refutation of the four alternatives, four extreme ways of things being through reasoning, and likewise showing that that there's not even a single particle of things being established as real that's observable. So first comes showing that it's unacceptable to have things as being real by showing that the qualities or properties that things possess cannot be real, and that's given in verse 384. The opponent here asserts there are real things because specific things or the qualities of things like specific qualities of things like fire and so forth exist. The answer is given: how can fire be hot when things do not exist? This was rejected or refuted above. It was said that even hot fire does not exist. How can fire be hot by way of its own intrinsic character? It cannot, for there are no real things. Above it was said that even hot fire does not exist intrinsically, and this is given up above in the 340 stanza 341, where it was said, that which is hot is fire, but how can that burn which is not hot? Thus, so-called fuel does not exist, and without it, fire too does not. And that point has already been rejected as well.
Oh yeah, that is also that Tashiga Rebecca Batella Tashiga over Meba Sheja Dojuna Teta Chuni Shijala Yava Bamba Kashi Tong Xiang Kade Ming over Tone Ming over Demar Meba 写下的道理吧，去哪？没有我通呢，没有我不通呢，没有我不呢，点把没把写下我的道理吧，去哪？太大，你道理吧，去哪点把出国，在那点着了，所谓点着就当太太当。也没有着急，你写下给点把出完了，你点把出完了，你要帮吧。你要帮吧，康熙同朝西家那样，你朝西家的要把它跟同为起来，你等住就朝开了，我没叫我说的哦。
Then next comes showing how this is rejected through the reasoning that examines the four sorts of extremes, four alternatives. And this is in 385. If through seeing things one could refute the statement that things do not exist, who then sees the elimination of fallacies regarding all four theses? Moreover, even if on seeing the thing which is fire, it were appropriate to refute the statement that fire is not real, one sees the elimination of fallacies associated with the real being of identity, real difference, and of all four theses such as existence and non-existence and so forth, which were exposed by the reasoning of dependent origination. Since all four theses have been seen to be flawed, one should not accept any thesis of things being real.
That is one. That didn't call that. Then you were never to do Tara Mammy Bani. Do they lie on you being can't do made a chitachum? Sanjana la many and teaching a Mandevao. Mandevao. Then they can't do Kali Meride. Meride. Do la Chasha you may. 大一个有点了，谢谢人们，这把天就把出了，是一个有的咱们这个考上一个学完了，学习都就搞完了，你这读了点前面得了谢谢人们，读了谢谢人们，这把天就把出了，现在告诉下把单。我们许多差不多点那样，你等别我原来没说中完了，没明白。没说什么没明白没明白这边我看到没把的其他的计划等把出吧其他计划等把出吧中央区的我为条款呢特殊区别你们有设计没人不明白他的3月你3节去生活了但呢没把你讲你也把开两把，那把他觉得没用啊，第一个钱呢，你得就开两把，特别做康单，得就开两把的了，特别做康单样嘛，这把我是哦。
So next shows showing that not even a single atom of things being real is observed, and that's given in verse 386. For the following reason also, or two, it is incorrect to assert that things are real. When there is nowhere even in particles or a particle a real thing, how can it occur? Even for Buddhas, it does not exist, thus it is irrelevant. As explained in the context of the verse 305, this also applies when one examines whether particles have parts. If there were some real thing, it should be observable even in extremely small things such as particles, but it is not observable. How can a real production occur for that which does not exist anywhere? It is totally incorrect to accept as existent that which is non-existent to the vision, is a perception, it says the vision of Buddhas, the sun-like radiance of whose consummate understanding of the reality of things dispels all darkness of ignorance. Asserting things to be real is thus unrelated to any feasible thesis. We'll stop there for today, for now.